The night she was born, the world outside their small mud house seemed strangely quiet, as if even the wind had paused to listen to her first cry. Her mother, weak from the long hours of labor, held her close to her chest. The child's tiny fingers curled instinctively around her mother's trembling thumb. For a brief moment, despite the poverty, despite the harsh life surrounding them, there was peace. A kind of warmth that survives only in the hearts of new mothers who believe, even if just for one night, that the future might be kinder to their child than it was to them. The mother whispered promises into the infant's ear, promises of protection, love, and a better life that she wasn't sure she could ever give, but she still vowed them, because a mother's hope is often stronger than her reality. The child's first years were marked by hunger, but also by laughter, soft giggles that filled their single-room home with a sweetness that money could never buy. She was a radiant little girl with hair the color of night, and eyes that sparkled like wet earth after rain. She would run barefoot through the dusty yard, chasing butterflies that always escaped her, but never discouraged her. Her mother would watch from the doorway, her thin lips stretched into a smile, even though the weight of life pressed hard on her shoulders. Every time her child stumbled, the mother rushed to catch her, wiping the dust off her bruised knees, whispering that everything would be fine. She wanted to believe it. She had to believe it. But poverty is a silent thief. It steals slowly, without warning, without mercy. One winter, their food ran out earlier than expected. The mother tried everything, cleaning homes, washing clothes, begging for extra work, but the world outside cared little for her struggles. She would often skip her meals, pretending she had already eaten, just so the child could have a cup of watery rice. The little girl was too young to understand sacrifice, too innocent to recognize the emptiness in her mother's eyes each night as she lulled her to sleep. Still, the bond between them was unbreakable. At night, the child would curl up next to her mother, resting her head on her chest, listening to her heartbeat. That rhythm became her comfort, her home. The mother would gently run her fingers through her daughter's hair, whispering stories of brave women, lost queens, and fierce warriors. She wanted her daughter to imagine a world where she mattered, where she wasn't bound by poverty or fate. She wanted her to dream freely, even if those dreams would never be realized. But life had a way of turning even the simplest dreams into distant, unreachable stars. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the old brick houses, painting the sky in hues of dying orange, a group of men arrived in their neighborhood. They were well dressed, riding horses that glistened under the fading light. People whispered about them. Rich traders from the city, looking for servants. The mother's heart froze when she saw them. She clutched her daughter protectively, her arms wrapping around the girl's small body, as if shielding her from a storm. The men questioned the villagers about families struggling to survive. Poverty was a language everyone understood here. It wasn't long before someone pointed toward her house. The mother tried to hide, but darkness has a cruel tendency of finding the desperate. When the men reached her home, she stood in the doorway, trembling, her daughter playing silently behind her. The tallest man spoke with a calm, cold tone, explaining how they could provide a better life for the child. Food, clothes, shelter. All they needed was her consent. Consent, a word that sounded like choice but felt like a trap. The mother refused. She refused again and again. She shouted, cried, pleaded for them to leave. But the men knew hunger better than she did. They knew desperation breeds weakness, and she was already breaking under the weight of her reality. They offered money, more than she had seen in years. Enough to survive the winter. Enough to buy food for months. Enough to stop her own suffering, even if it meant creating a new suffering inside her heart. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat beside her daughter, watching her tiny chest rise and fall with each breath. Every breath was a reminder of the love she had, and every silence between those breaths reminded her of the life she couldn't provide. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she touched her daughter's forehead. She wanted to protect her from the world, but she herself was drowning in it. When morning came, she made the hardest decision of her life. The sun hadn't fully risen when the men returned. She held her daughter tightly, pressing her lips to her forehead, inhaling her scent as if trying to memorize it forever. Her hands shook violently as she loosened her grip. Her daughter blinked at her, confused, unaware of the storm unfolding around her. The mother whispered, "Forgive me," though she knew the child was too young to understand. The moment the men lifted the little girl into their carriage, the child reached out her hands.
"Calling, Amy."
"Amy," with a voice that cracked through the morning air like thunder. The mother felt something inside her shatter, something that could never be repaired. She took a step forward, then another, but stopped. Her knees buckled. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming. Tears blinded her as she watched her daughter's small figure disappear down the dusty road, her cries echoing long after the carriage vanished. Days turned into weeks. Silence filled the home where laughter once lived. The mother stopped speaking. She stopped smiling. She stopped living. The villagers whispered about her. Some called her heartless. Others pitied her. But no one truly understood the war inside her. She had not abandoned her daughter out of lack of love. She had abandoned her because of love twisted by desperation. But the world never sees the heart, it only sees the actions. Meanwhile, the little girl's new life began far from home. She became a servant, a slave to a household that valued obedience over innocence. She learned to wake before the sun, to clean floors until her fingers cracked, to obey commands without question. Her childhood, so brief, so fragile, was taken from her piece by piece. At night, when the house was silent, she would lie awake, clutching an old piece of fabric from her mother's dress. It was the only thing she had left of her past. She would press it to her face, trying to remember the warmth of the arms that once held her. But memories fade, especially when they are built on pain. She rarely spoke. She rarely smiled. But deep inside her, buried beneath layers of loneliness and sorrow, was a tiny flicker. One last memory of a love she did not fully understand. A love that had been stolen from her before she even learned how to protect it. Years passed. She grew into a young woman, beautiful, graceful, yet hollow. Her eyes no longer sparkled. They reflected only the weight of survival. She didn't remember her mother's face clearly, only the echo of a voice, the softness of a touch, and the haunting sound of her own cries as she was taken away. She had learned to live without answers, without closure, without family. She believed that chapter of her life was closed forever. She believed her mother had chosen to abandon her. She did not know the truth. She did not know her mother cried every night for the daughter she lost. She did not know fate was already writing a reunion neither of them expected. She did not know the story was far from over. Her new life began with the sound of footsteps. Heavy, impatient, echoing through the stone hallways of the house she had been sold into. The mansion was enormous, far bigger than anything she had ever seen, but its size never impressed her. To her, everything inside felt cold. The marble floors, the tall wooden doors, even the voices of the people, everything lacked warmth. It was as if she had stepped into a life where emotions did not exist. The people who owned the house spoke to her like she was an object, something to be moved, cleaned, or corrected. She was no longer a child with soft cheeks and hopeful eyes. She was now a slave, and slaves were not supposed to feel. At first, she cried every night. She would curl up in the small corner of the servants' quarters and press her face against her knees, trying to hide the sound of her sobs. The older servants warned her that crying would get her punished, so she learned to be silent, crying only when she was sure no one would notice. She held onto the fabric from her mother's dress, now worn and frayed at the edges. It was the only memory tethering her to the life she once had. Over time, even that fabric began to lose the scent she clung to so desperately. Her days were long. Before sunrise, she was expected to be awake. She swept the hallways, cleaned the kitchen, scrubbed clothes in icy water that left her fingers red and cracked. She learned to move quietly, to speak only when spoken to, and to endure the sharp words that came her way. Sometimes, the mistress of the house would shout at her for mistakes she didn't even make. Other times, she would punish her simply because she wanted to feel powerful. The young girl grew used to being blamed. She learned that in a life of servitude, Truth mattered little when power decided everything. But pain didn't only come from work or words. It came from the loneliness that wrapped itself around her like chains. She had no one to talk to, no one to smile with, no one to cry to. The other servants were older and focused on their own survival. They pitied her but offered no comfort. In that house, showing kindness was dangerous. It could be punished as rebellion. So they kept their distance, leaving her to navigate the harsh world on her own. As the years passed, she grew taller, her shoulders more defined from the endless labor. Her once childlike softness faded into a quiet strength. But it was the kind of strength built from suffering, not choice. Her eyes changed too. They no longer sparkled with innocence. Instead, they held a depth too heavy for someone so young. A depth that came from silent endurance, from absorbing pain without having anyone to share it with. When she looked into the polished pots she cleaned, she no longer recognized the face staring back. She wasn't the child who ran barefoot in a dusty yard, chasing butterflies. She was someone else now, someone shaped by hardship, shaped by abandonment. Although she told herself she didn't remember her mother, fragments of memories still returned, uninvited, like ghosts haunting the corners of her mind. Sometimes she remembered a warm hand brushing her hair. Sometimes a soft voice singing her to sleep. Sometimes the blurry shape of a woman's face pressed against hers. But she never allowed herself to think too deeply. Those memories hurt more than any physical punishment. They reminded her of a time when she was loved, when she mattered to someone, when life felt gentle. Now love felt like a story someone else lived. She convinced herself that her mother must have forgotten her long ago. No one who loved their child would let them be taken. At least, that's what she believed, because believing otherwise would break whatever pieces of her heart remained. Despite everything, there was something resilient inside her, something that refused to die. Even though life tested it every day, she carried her grief like a shadow. It followed her in every room, every task, every breath. But grief also built a strange kind of discipline. She became determined not to break down again. The more she suffered, the quieter she became, as if silence was her shield. In silence she survived. Over time, the household noticed her beauty. Even covered in dust and wearing worn-out clothes, she possessed a natural grace that couldn't be hidden. Her face, though somber, had a softness that drew attention. Her eyes, though sad, held a depth that made people pause. Her movements were delicate, almost poetic, even when she was doing the most menial tasks. The mistress disliked this. She saw the way guests looked at the young slave, some with admiration, others with something darker in their eyes. Jealousy and insecurity twisted inside her, fueling cruelty. One winter night, the mistress called the young woman to her chamber. The room was warm from the large fireplace, a sharp contrast to the freezing servants' quarters. The mistress stared at her with narrowed eyes, her tone dripping with bitterness as she scolded her for things she hadn't done. She accused her of trying to attract attention, of being lazy, of being ungrateful. The young woman kept her head bowed, her hands clasped together, her voice as soft as a feather when she murmured apologies she didn't owe. When the mistress lifted her hand and struck her across the face, she did not cry. She felt the sting, the burn of humiliation, but she did not cry. She refused to give the world the satisfaction of seeing her break. That became her strength, not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain control her. There were moments, however, when her strength faltered. Moments when she stood by the window in the early morning light, watching birds fly freely across the sky, and she wondered what freedom felt like. Was it warm like the memories of her mother's arms? Was it peaceful like the dreams she once held? Or was it simply the absence of fear? Sometimes she imagined walking out of the mansion's gates, leaving behind the walls that felt like a prison. But dreaming was dangerous. Dreams made hope grow, and hope was something she was afraid to carry. Hope made loss feel heavier. One day, while she was sweeping the courtyard, she saw a little girl holding her mother's hand as they passed by the gates. The child laughed, tugging at her mother's dress, asking for something only a mother could understand. The sight pierced her heart like a knife. Her breath caught in her chest, her hands froze mid-sweep. She stared at them until they disappeared from view, and when they were gone, she realized she had stopped breathing for a moment. Her chest tightened with an old ache. A memory resurfaced, a memory of her own hand once holding a mother's hand, a memory of warmth she could no longer touch. She turned away quickly, forcing herself to work, pretending the moment didn't matter. But it did. It mattered more than she would ever admit. That night, as she lay on her thin mattress, she covered her face with her hands and allowed herself to cry silently. She cried for the childhood she lost. She cried for the mother she could not remember clearly. She cried for the girl she used to be, the girl who believed the world could be kind. Her tears soaked the pillow, and she tried to quiet her sobs so the others wouldn't hear. When the tears stopped, she felt empty but lighter, as though releasing the pain made space for another day of survival. Years continued to pass, and she became known in the household for her quiet nature and diligence. She never argued, never resisted, and always obeyed. To the owners, this made her a perfect servant. To the other slaves, it made her a symbol of endurance. She wasn't vocal or rebellious, but she was strong in a way suffering people often are, quietly, invisibly deeply. But despite everything, she still carried an emptiness that no amount of work could distract her from. It was a sorrow woven into her soul. She often wondered whether she was forgotten by the woman who had given birth to her. Did her mother ever think of her? Did she regret it? Did she cry? Did she move on? Questions like these rose in her mind like smoke, lingering long after she tried to blow them away. What she didn't know was that fate was watching her. Fate had carved a path for her that she couldn't yet see. A path that would lead her back to the past she had spent years trying to forget. A path that would force her to face the truth behind her abandonment. A path that would lead her back to the very woman who broke her heart, even though neither knew the other still lived. And soon, that path would begin. The morning began like any other, silent, cold, indifferent. She woke before the sun, as she always did, and moved quietly through the servants' quarters, careful not to disturb those who were still asleep. Her body functioned on habit now. She didn't need thought, only movement. She washed her face, tied her hair back, and stepped into the courtyard to begin another day of work. The sky above her was pale, streaked with the soft colors of dawn, but even the beauty of morning never touched her anymore. Beauty belonged to a world she no longer lived in. She was sweeping fallen leaves near the stone path when she heard footsteps approaching from the main gate. Slow, heavy, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. The household rarely received guests this early, so curiosity flickered inside her for the first time in years. She straightened her back and stepped aside, lowering her gaze as protocol demanded. From the corner of her eye, she saw the guards open the gate, bowing respectfully to whoever stood outside. A carriage rolled in, its wheels crunching against the gravel. It was elegant, polished, and marked with gold detailing. Someone important had arrived. The doors of the carriage opened, and a figure stepped out, a woman draped in a shawl of deep earthy colors. She walked slowly, deliberately, as though every step carried the weight of many years. Her posture was strong, but her face, partly shadowed by her veil, held a wariness that could not be hidden by fabric or grace. The mistress of the house rushed out to greet her, bowing formally. The young slave knew what was expected. She quietly lowered her head and resumed sweeping, pretending not to listen. But something about the visitor's presence stirred a strange, uneasy feeling in her chest. The air felt different, heavier, almost electric. She continued her work, though her hands trembled slightly, which annoyed her because she rarely lost control of herself. She tried to ignore the unfamiliar sensation, twisting inside her, yet something compelled her to look, just once. She lifted her eyes briefly. Their gazes met for less than a heartbeat. The world stopped moving. The visitor froze. Her breath caught mid-inhale. Her eyes widened behind the veil, filling with a kind of shock that bordered on disbelief. She took a step forward, then paused, her fingers trembling as she clutched the shawl around her shoulders. The young woman felt something inside her shift violently, like a buried memory clawing its way to the surface. She didn't recognize the visitor, not clearly, not consciously. But there was something familiar in the shape of her eyes, the way her lips pressed together, the tremor in her gaze. Something she didn't understand. Something frightening. She quickly looked away, ashamed for breaking the rules of eye contact. She bent down and swept harder, her heart beating far too fast. She told herself it was nothing. A stranger. Just another visitor, yet her pulse refused to calm. Meanwhile, the older woman stood frozen in place, staring at the young slave as if she had seen a ghost from her past. Her breath shook. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. The mistress noticed her distress and stepped closer, asking politely if she was unwell. But the visitor didn't answer. Her eyes remained locked on the girl sweeping the courtyard. Eyes that suddenly filled with tears she fought desperately to control. She whispered a name, one the young slave had not heard in years, maybe not since childhood. It was faint, broken, like the echo of a memory buried too deep. The girl stopped sweeping. The broom slipped from her hands and fell to the ground with a soft thud. Her chest tightened painfully. She didn't understand why that name made her heart jolt violently, as though recognizing something her mind could not. The mistress heard the whisper and looked confused. She followed the visitor's gaze and frowned slightly at the sight of the servant. "Her," she said coldly. "She is just one of the workers. Pay no attention to her." But the visitor could not look away. Her lips trembled as she whispered again, her voice cracking. "It can't be. But those eyes, that face." The mistress stiffened at this display of emotion. "Would you like to come inside?" she asked, forcing politeness. "You must be tired." The visitor nodded numbly, but her eyes lingered on the young woman until the last possible moment. When she finally turned away, her steps were uneven, as if the ground beneath her had suddenly become unstable. Inside the mansion, as she removed her veil, her tears finally escaped. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, trying to stop the flood of emotions. The mistress noticed and, though irritated, asked softly, "Has something troubling you?" The visitor swallowed hard. "That girl," she whispered. "Who is she? How long has she been here?" The mistress answered casually, unaware of the storm forming beside her. She explained the slave's background, how she had arrived as a small child, how she had grown up working for the household, how she had always been quiet and obedient. With every word, the visitor's heart clenched tighter. A small child, sold into servitude around the same age, around the same time. Her breathing grew uneven. Her hands shook uncontrollably. "Are you sure," she asked, her voice quivering, "that she had no family with her? No mother, no one?" The mistress shrugged, uninterested. "I doubt it. Children sold into slavery rarely come with family." The visitor closed her eyes. A tear fell down her cheek. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "What have I done?" Meanwhile, outside, the young slave struggled with the strange heaviness lodged inside her chest. She tried to return to her routine, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the visitor. Why had the woman looked at her that way? Why had she whispered that name? Why had her eyes filled with such overwhelming emotion? She finished her duties mechanically, but her hands slipped often, and she found herself stopping to breathe because her heart felt strangely tight. There was a tug inside her, an uncomfortable pull that she couldn't understand but couldn't ignore. It was as if something she had buried long ago was trying to rise, demanding to be seen. Later that afternoon, she was called to bring tea to the guest room, where the visitor sat with the mistress. Her hands shook as she carried the tray, and she mentally scolded herself for her lack of control. She entered the room quietly, keeping her gaze on the floor. But the moment she stepped inside, the visitor inhaled sharply, as if seeing her again reopened a wound that had barely begun bleeding. The girl felt the intensity of the woman's stare even without looking. Her breath caught. Something inside her stirred violently, fear, confusion, a strange familiarity she didn't want to acknowledge. "Come closer," the mistress ordered. The girl obeyed, stepping forward slowly. The visitor's eyes filled with tears instantly. Her hand trembled as she reached out, hesitating inches away from the girl's face. The slave froze, terrified. The visitor quickly withdrew her hand, afraid of frightening her further. The mistress frowned. "She's just a servant," she said, confused by the visitor's emotional reaction. But the visitor whispered, her voice breaking with unbearable sorrow, "She is not just anything." Her eyes remained locked on the young woman, eyes that seemed to see her soul, not just her face. And in that moment, something broke inside the girl. A rush of warmth, an old, nearly forgotten warmth, flashed through her chest. A smell, a touch, a lullaby. A feeling she hadn't allowed herself to remember for so many years. She stepped back suddenly, shaken, her breath unsteady. She didn't know why tears burned at the corners of her eyes. She didn't know why she wanted to run, or why she wanted to stay, or why her heart recognized something her mind had forgotten. The visitor covered her face with her hands and cried silently. The girl stood trembling, confused, overwhelmed. The mistress looked between them, baffled. And fate watched quietly. Knowing the truth, the mother and daughter who had been torn apart by desperation, time, and suffering, had just re-encountered each other without recognizing the full truth yet. But destiny was just beginning to uncover the secrets buried in their hearts. The night fell slowly over the mansion, turning the courtyard into a pool of shadows and muted moonlight. The young slave's chores were done, yet her heart refused to settle. Every breath she took felt too quick, too shallow. Every sound felt louder, sharper, as though the world around her had suddenly awakened with attention she didn't understand. She sat on her thin mattress in the servants' room, staring at her hands, hands that had been trembling ever since she encountered the mysterious visitor. Her palms were still warm, as though the woman's gaze had touched her skin. She closed her eyes, and again she saw the woman's trembling lips, the tears brimming in her eyes, the soft whisper of a name that somehow made her chest tighten painfully. That name, why did it feel familiar? Why did it hurt? She had spent years training herself not to think about her past. Memories only caused suffering, and survival demanded forgetting. Yet something about the visitor had cracked a door she once bolted shut. Now, faint images flickered through her mind, blurred, incomplete, like shadows moving behind frosted glass, a voice singing softly, a warm hand on her cheek, a pair of arms holding her during cold nights, a woman crying, her tears falling onto the child's hair. She pressed her hands to her temples, trying to force the images away, but they only grew stronger. She exhaled shakily. She didn't want this. She didn't want confusion. She didn't want hope. Hope had hurt her before, broken her beyond repair, and she had spent her entire life stitching herself back together with silence. Yet the visitor's face kept returning. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, the visitor, her mother, sat alone in the guest room. The fireplace flickered softly, casting warm orange light across her tear-streaked face. Her shawl lay crumpled on the floor as she sat hunched forward on the small sofa, her fingers trembling against her lips. She had held herself together for so many years, living with guilt lodged in her heart like a thorn she never tried to remove. Now, seeing the young woman who looked like the ghost of her past, had torn open every wound she'd hidden beneath layers of time. She whispered to herself between broken breaths, "My daughter, my little girl, is it truly you?" The pain in her voice echoed through the empty room. She felt as though fate had shown her a miracle, only to hold it just out of reach. She wanted to rush to the girl, hold her, explain everything, explain why she had done the unforgivable. But her courage failed her. She feared the young woman would reject her, push her away, hate her. And perhaps the girl would be right to do so. What right did she have to ask for forgiveness after so many years? What right did she have to hope for love from the child she had abandoned? She sorrowfully wiped her tears, but more kept falling, unstoppable and raw. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling as she whispered, "If she truly is my daughter, what do I do now? How do I tell her? How do I face her?" Unknown to her, the mistress of the house stood near the doorway, watching quietly. She had seen many emotions in her life: anger, jealousy, pride. But the expression on the visitor's face was something she wasn't equipped to understand. There was a depth to that sorrow, a kind of heartbreak that no simple words could explain. Later that night, curiosity, or perhaps fate, pulled the young slave out of her bed. She stepped into the courtyard, the cold air brushing against her face. She breathed deeply, trying to steady the storm inside her. Moonlight spilled across the stone tiles, illuminating the path that led to the guest wing. She didn't know why, but her feet moved in that direction. Something in her heart whispered that she needed answers, even if she was too afraid to hear them. As she approached the entrance, she hesitated. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch the wooden door. She took a quiet breath, gathering courage, and stepped inside. The visitor sat silently, her eyes closed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, the girl stood frozen, unsure of whether she should leave. But then the visitor's eyes opened, and their gazes collided once again. This time with no distractions, no witnesses, no barriers. The woman's breath caught. Tears immediately filled her eyes. She rose slowly, almost cautiously, as though afraid she might scare the girl away. The young slave took a small step back, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with 1,000 words neither could say. The visitor took a trembling step forward. Her voice came out soft, broken, fragile. "What is your name, child?" The girl hesitated, unsure why such a simple question felt difficult. She answered softly, "I was never given a name, not truly. The mistress calls me whatever she wishes." The visitor's heart shattered at those words. Her daughter, her precious baby, didn't even have a name. The woman clenched her hands at her sides, fighting the urge to collapse. She whispered, "When you were born, I gave you a name." The girl's chest tightened. Something stirred inside her, but she remained silent, afraid of where this was going. The woman stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I named you." She spoke the name the girl had not heard in years. The name whispered in Section 3, the name that had shaken her soul. The young woman's eyes widened. Her breath stopped. The world around her faded into a blur. That name she had heard echoing faintly in her earliest memories. She staggered slightly, as though struck by an invisible force. Tears prickled at her eyes, and she tried to blink them away, but they fell anyway. She didn't know whether she was afraid, angry, or just overwhelmed. The visitor reached out, hesitantly, desperately. You are my daughter." The girl's heart felt like it had been torn open. A rush of emotions flooded her. Confusion, anger, longing, fear, hope, grief. She stepped back instinctively, shaking her head, her voice trembling. No, that can't be. My mother, she left me. She gave me away." The woman flinched as though stabbed. "I never wanted to," she whispered. "They forced me to. I was starving, I had nothing. I thought you would die if you stayed with me. I made the worst mistake of my life, and I have paid for it every day since." The girl squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head again, but tears poured down her cheeks. She backed into the wall, pressing her trembling hands against it for support. "I was alone," she whispered angrily. I suffered so much, and you weren't there." The woman broke completely, falling to her knees. Her voice cracked as she choked on her tears. I know. And I have lived with that guilt every day. I searched for you. I asked everyone. I tried to follow every lead, but you were gone before I could reach you. I never stopped loving you. Never." The young woman covered her mouth as sobs escaped her. A lifetime of suppressed pain burst forth in a single moment. She slid down the wall, her knees folding beneath her. She cried, raw, uncontrollable, years-long tears that she had buried deep inside her soul. The woman crawled forward hesitantly, terrified of hurting her further. "Please," she whispered. "Please look at me. I am still your mother. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I don't deserve your love. But if I could take your pain and place it in my own heart, I would. If I could go back and die in your place, I would. If I could rewrite our past, I would." The girl finally looked up, eyes red, face wet, lips trembling. "Why," she whispered. "Why after so many years?" The woman cried even harder. "Because fate finally brought me to you. Because I finally found you. And because I cannot leave this world without telling you the truth. That I never abandoned you out of lack of love. I abandoned you because I loved you too much to watch you die with me." The young woman's chest heaved as she tried to breathe through the storm inside her. Her heart felt like it was breaking open, releasing sorrow she didn't know she still carried. She pressed a hand to her chest, her voice whispering like a wounded child. I waited for someone to come for me. I waited for years. The mother's body shook violently. I came, she whispered. I came too late. They sat there, both broken, both trembling, both crying, locked in a moment suspended between past and present, pain and healing, loss and love. For the first time in years, the young girl whispered the word she had buried deep inside her. Mother. The woman gasped, covering her mouth as fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. She reached out again, slower this time, giving her daughter the choice. The girl hesitated, then moved forward, collapsing into her mother's arms. And in that fragile, shattering moment, their hearts, wrecked by time, finally recognized each other. The room felt impossibly still, as if even time had paused to witness the fragile moment unfolding between them. The young woman's breath trembled in the silence, her chest rising unevenly as she fought the storm inside her. Her mother stood only a few steps away, but those steps felt like the distance of an entire lifetime, filled with abandonment, unanswered questions, and years of loneliness that no one ever tried to heal. The mother's lips quivered as she struggled to speak, but the girl's expression had already said everything. Pain, betrayal, and the haunting ache of a child left to survive alone. For the first time since their unexpected reunion, the girl allowed herself to really look at the woman in front of her. Not the stranger who had returned with regret in her eyes, but the mother she once dreamed of every night. She studied the lines on her mother's face, the silver strands of hair that had replaced youthful black, the exhaustion that seemed carved into her bones. It was a face life had not been kind to, but then life had not been kind to her either. Something hollow and fragile shifted in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to sympathy, but she crushed it before it could grow. The mother slowly stepped closer, her eyes glistening. I searched for you, she whispered, voice cracking. For years, my child, I searched everywhere. The girl's hands tightened at her sides. Her voice came out low, trembling, but sharp enough to cut through the air. You didn't search hard enough. The mother's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, tears spilled freely down her cheeks. She took a shaking breath and tried again, her voice barely holding together. I was forced and I had no choice. They threatened our lives. They wanted to take you because you were the only thing they knew could break me. The truth, once spoken, did not heal anything, not immediately. Instead, it floated between them like a wound reopened, forcing both to confront the memories buried too deep and too painfully. The girl had imagined 1,000 reasons why her mother left, some cruel, some selfish, but she had never imagined this. She didn't know whether to believe it or push the truth away before it softened her anger. Her mother reached out a trembling hand but stopped halfway, terrified, hopeful. You were my whole world. Losing you. She pressed a hand against her chest as if trying to hold her heart together. Losing you was the day my soul died. The words washed over the young woman, stirring emotions she wasn't ready to feel. All her life she had believed she wasn't wanted, wasn't loved, wasn't worth staying for. She had wrapped those beliefs around herself like a shield, building walls so high no one could climb them. But now those walls were trembling, not breaking, but shaking under the weight of everything unsaid. A part of her wanted to scream, to cry out all the years of suffering, to demand why she had been left to starve emotionally while her mother lived knowing her child was lost somewhere. Another part, smaller, quieter, reminded her of nights she cried herself to sleep wishing for her mother's voice, her mother's warmth, her mother's arms around her. That small part hurt the most. The mother swallowed hard, wiping her tears with the back of her trembling hand. If you cannot forgive me now, I understand, she whispered. If you hate me, I deserve it. But let me at least tell you the truth. Let me at least die knowing you heard it. Her voice cracked on the last word, day, and something inside the girl twisted painfully. The idea of losing her mother again, even after all the hatred, all the years, felt like a second abandonment she wasn't sure she could survive. The young woman closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a long breath as she steadied herself. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely more than a trembling whisper. "Tell me everything." And so, her mother did. She spoke of the night men had broken into their home, threatening to kill the child if she didn't cooperate. She spoke of begging, fighting, pleading for the chance to hold her daughter one last time. She described the years that followed, how she searched through markets, slave houses, hidden communities, and distant towns. How she sold everything, spent everything, lost everything just to find a trace of her child. How she never gave up, even when everyone told her the girl must be dead. How every night she prayed for a miracle, and every morning she woke up with nothing but guilt crushing her chest. With every word, the young woman felt her anger and her sorrow weaving together in ways she didn't know how to separate. Her heart ached with the image of the mother she once loved, desperate and broken. But her heart also ached with the memory of the girl she once was. Hungry, beaten, lonely, crying for a mother who never came. When her mother finally finished speaking, there was silence. A deep, still silence that seemed to stretch out forever. The young woman's hands shook as she slowly sank to the floor, her breath unstable, her emotions too overwhelming to contain. She had spent her entire life building strength out of her wounds. But now, faced with the truth, she felt like that wounded child again. Lost, confused, longing for love she had convinced herself she didn't need. Her mother knelt in front of her, moving slowly, as if afraid the girl would break if touched too suddenly. She reached out again, but this time she didn't try to hold her daughter. She placed her trembling hand on the floor instead. Near her, but not touching, offering closeness without force, love without pressure, the girl stared at that hand. So close yet so hesitant, so fragile yet so full of meaning. Her breath hitched, her voice cracked. Why didn't you fight harder?" The mother's tears fell silently. "I did," she whispered, "but I was only one woman, and they were too powerful. They took you because they knew I couldn't fight them all. But I never stopped trying, not even for a breath." The girl's eyes filled, the tears blurring her vision until the world around her vanished. She wasn't crying because she forgave her mother. Not yet. She wasn't crying because the pain was gone. Because it wasn't. She was crying because for the first time, she saw the truth she had never been ready to see. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. Her mother had lost her. And there was a difference big enough to crack her heart open and let something raw and vulnerable spill out. Slowly, shakily, the girl lifted her hand and placed it over her mother's. The moment their hands touched, her mother gasped softly, as if the smallest gesture from her child was a gift too precious to bear. The girl's voice trembled. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she whispered honestly. "Not today. Maybe not soon." Her mother nodded, tears falling like rain. "I understand." The girl continued, swallowing hard. "I don't want to hate you anymore." The mother covered her mouth with her free hand, sobbing in relief. Her shoulders shook, her entire body trembling with the weight of emotions she had carried for years. "Then let me stay by your side," she whispered through her tears. "Let me earn whatever pieces of your heart you're willing to give." The girl looked at her mother for a long, silent moment. In her eyes there was pain, but also something softer, something new, something that could one day grow into peace. "I'm willing to try," she whispered. And that simple sentence, fragile, hesitant, but sincere, was enough to change everything. The mother reached out and slowly, carefully pulled her daughter into her arms. This time, the girl didn't pull away. She didn't crumble, didn't fight. She let herself be held by the woman she had both loved and hated, the woman who had been both her wound and her healing. They cried together, holding each other as the past slowly loosened its grip on their hearts. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't healing, not completely. But it was a beginning born from truth. A beginning built on pain that had finally been spoken. A beginning shaped by two broken hearts trying, after so many years, to find their way back to each other. And as the mother whispered soft apologies into her daughter's hair, and the daughter allowed herself, for the first time, to lean into her mother's embrace. The room finally breathed again, as if the universe itself had been waiting for this moment of fragile, beautiful reconciliation. It was not the end of their story. It was the first real chapter.